Hello, my name's John Illingsworth. I grew up in this area, Pittwater, at Newport, and my memories of koalas are very strong. In those days, in the early 1950s, there wasn't a lot of development and there were koalas. I recall, as a child, seeing koalas walking up and down the street on a number of occasions. It was not a terribly unusual thing. You'd always go out to have a look at that. It was fascinating. But that was it. It was part of life down here. I think they were probably moving from places where they'd been disturbed towards thicker bush, which was nearby to where we lived. When I was about 17 or 18, I recall seeing a koala being attacked by a dog. And I watched this from a fairly close distance until I could safely intervene. And what happened was the koala was crossing from tree to tree. The dog got it and chased it. And as the koala felt the dog's breath on its neck, it span around to face the koala. And koalas have very strong and vicious claws, and they can do a lot of damage. And the dog's aware of this, so the dog would back off. But the koala's objective was to get to the tree and go up it. And so ultimately, it turned away from the dog, ran to the tree, in which case the dog got it. The koala turned to face the dog, and they're not a very adroit beast. It was clumsy. It fell over on its back, and the dog went straight in and got it by the throat. In that case, I intervened, I beat the dog off, koala ended up going up the tree, and I think it was okay. But that's what happens with dogs. Koalas are irresistible to dogs, as are many other small native animals. So koalas, from then on, were declining. I think by the 1970s, from Mona Vale to Palm Beach, that's the Pittwater area, there was said to be 120 odd koalas. I know that by the time I moved to live at Clareville, at the back of Avalon, there weren't many koalas left then. And the last I personally know of koalas down here were the koalas I heard calling from our backyard at Clareville around 1978-79. So koalas were in decline from the time I was a young man. And those factors were largely due to development, most importantly loss of habitat. Koalas, as I understand it, have about 7 principal trees that they feed on. Those trees, most of those trees, except for the scribbly gum, became very rare down here, so there wasn't much variety. In the late 1960s, I was working for Fauna Productions, and they were the producers of Skippy. I was the animal handler, and I handled koalas. We had several koalas in a zoo that myself and a couple of other people maintained. I learned that koalas had about 7 principal trees, the species of trees that they needed for vegetation, and only about 4 of those trees were readily available out here, and all but one of them were relatively scarce. It was scribbly gum was the most commonly available tree, and my koalas got more scribbly gum than perhaps they should have, but because I was always at my wit's end to find a blue gum or a Bangalay to vary their diet. And of course, it was a constant thing that went all year. So I imagine that as progress went on and the trees were knocked down, that those trees became scarce and only scribbly gums remained. Perhaps that's why those koalas developed weepy eyes, which I understand it now to be chlamydia. So the problems were habitat loss and dogs and cars. And all of these things are part and parcel of the way we carry on with modern life now. Down here, loss of habitat's a real problem because we're on a peninsula, which is joined up to the mainland there, but we're stuck on a peninsula out from Mona Vale to Palm Beach. So that if you lose a section of habitat going from Pittwater across to the ocean, which is the case, then you only have isolated populations of trees, and that means you have isolated populations of the animals that depend on those trees. And that's how Angophora Reserve, the 17 hectare reserve at Avalon, became so important, because it became an isolated pocket that had been cut off. During the 1950s, there were several large bushfires that spread over from Newport and went up over what was then called Newport Plateau, just over there. And those bushfires were very, very fierce. I recall them very clearly. There were at least two, and they were in the 1950s. Now, that must have decimated the populations of koalas on the plateau, what is now known as Bilgola Plateau, which in those days didn't have a house on it. And it would have isolated Angophora Reserve, which is a very substantial 17 hectare reserve. So I think all koalas basically retreated to Angophora Reserve. Koalas do not live in one tree. They move from tree to tree. They do that because they want a variety of vegetation, or because they've eaten that tree out, they need to go to another, and they do it because they're looking for a mate. So they're reasonably mobile creatures, and that's why they're at risk of dog attack and why they get hit by cars. So it is important that koala habitat be linked. You have to have corridors, wildlife corridors, for the koalas to go from tree to tree or from mate to mate, as they need to do. What's happening today is we're fragmenting all of our bushlands. We know this is happening at Campbelltown, or it's in danger of happening at Campbelltown, where the most viable colony of koalas in New South Wales is. So I think we should look at what happened down here as a precautionary tale. We had koalas in dwindling numbers, about 123 in 1970, down to, by 1989, just 4. One of which was nursed back to good health by Taronga Park Zoo and re-released into Angophora Reserve. After that, I don't think there were any koalas. Those 4 koalas were the last, and they were all in Angophora Reserve. So I would like to say to Rob Stokes, who is the local member for Pittwater, and a man I know, and I know he's a decent man. He's also a very powerful man. He's the Planning Minister. And I would like to see Rob Stokes get on a unity ticket with Matt Keane and take on the 42 recommendations of the Upper House inquiry into koalas and make them all happen. Because can you, Rob and Matt Keane, can you think of a more iconic Australian animal than the koala? I can't. And because you've got the power, and because you've got the position as Planning Minister, and you have been an Environment Minister, you know what this is about. So I want to ask you, Rob, do you want to be the person who presides over the demise of the koala, especially at Campbelltown? I think not. But it will happen unless you, as Planning Minister, get on with Matt Keane. We don't want this to happen to remaining viable colonies of koalas, particularly the one at Campbelltown. So as Planning Minister, you have enormous power, and you have also been Environment Minister. You understand these problems, or you should. I want to ask you to personally oversee the implementation of the 42 recommendations of the Upper House inquiry into the koala, because that's the only way we're going to save these animals from functional extinction by 2050. That's widely recognised. It's over to you, Rob. Probably nobody else can do it, and nobody else is in a better position than you. Let's hope you can.